Sigma, I want you to see what we're doing with your camera. You got it?
For this video, we partnered with Sigma. More on that after the intro.
We are not going to waste your time with any creative hook to try to keep your attention. Instead, we are just going to give you an overview of what's going to happen in this video. Noah and I will be sharing the task of presenting this video as we take a deep dive into the technical and creative sides of this camera. So let's start out with a technical overview of the camera, but first, here are some disclaimers.
Just before the intro, I mentioned that we partnered with Sigma on this video, and I just want to briefly outline what that entails. We reached out to Sigma and they offered to send us this gear, the FP, the kit lens that comes with it, as well as a few other lenses, on loan for a couple of weeks. We don't get to keep the gear, no money exchanged hands, they don't get any input on this video or the process of making this video. They don't get to see it before it's published or anything like that. Our opinions are all our own. I also just want to make a quick note here that this video was filmed on 3 different cameras. We have shots from the FP, from the Sony A7riii, and the Fuji X-T3. Because of this, to help keep you, the viewer, clear on what each clip is, we're going to have a little title in the lower thirds about which clip was filmed with which camera, every time the scene changes, basically.
So this is what the camera looks like right out of the box. It's very small, very compact. I mean, it is the size of my hand, which is very impressive. And it's not all that thick. I would say it's about an inch thick, which is also quite impressive for the features that are packed into this little camera. So let's go over what the body is like. Overall, very durable feeling construction. There are no panels that flex when you press on them. The screen is also very sturdy feeling. The whole construction just feels solid. There's a lot of metal everywhere. The buttons are also very tactile and they don't feel cheap, which is very nice, especially if you're going to be using the buttons a lot. This camera has a full frame sensor, and you can see that huge sensor just crammed into this tiny body, which is kind of impressive to look at. Also, on the bottom, you have your battery hatch here. So I'm going to come over to this side over here where we can see there's a microphone jack here. There is a micro HDMI. There are some pins for a handy little extender that you get right here that can slap onto the side, but I'll talk about that in just a tiny bit. And then up here you have a USB-C where you can record onto a SSD. Now this will be used quite a bit. I honestly don't love these floppy pieces of rubber. I wish they'd just gone with some sort of removable cover for this side. And before I move on, I just want to mention that this USB-C can be used for charging. However, the camera does have to be off for it to be charged, and you can't charge while recording. So as I mentioned, there's this little add-on which you can just slap onto the side like so, and screw right on. And this gives you a hot shoe and a locking mechanism to hold in your micro HDMI cable so it doesn't yank out when you're recording. And that'd be if you're using an external recorder. There are a bunch of handy screw ports on this camera. For instance, this side has a 1/4 inch thread here. It has one on the bottom, and it also has one over here on this side. And this is very handy, especially when you are rigging this camera up with a bunch of stuff, because this side piece will use one, and if you slap that on, you might think, oh, well, I'm down to 2, but nope, you have another one right here. The connectivity of this camera is quite impressive, except for one glaring omission, and that is a headphone jack. Now understand, it is a very compact design, so that might have not been super important considering this camera's intended market. So this screen does have a touchscreen capability. It's solidly fixed to the camera. It does not tilt in any direction, so you won't be able to look at this from many angles other than straight on. But if you hook up an external monitor or recorder, that'll allow you to get more angles for you to look at the screen. As you can see, the touchscreen capability is not all that great. I am in the quick settings menu and I can't do anything. It's not allowing me to go through anything. If I go to menu, nothing's happening. As you can see, I can choose a focus point for this camera with the touchscreen, but that feature is kind of pointless considering that the autofocus is really not usable in video for this camera. So the touchscreen, I think if you could use it in the quick settings menu or in the regular menu, it would be a great feature. But how it's designed right now, where it's primarily just in the recording window, it's not all that useful. So now that we've gone over the physical aspects of the camera, I want to dive into the technical specifications and the price. So let's start out with how much money you have to fork over to Sigma to make this camera yours. And currently the pricing starts at $1,700. Now this is actually a pretty good deal because the specs are impressive. This shoots up to 4K 12-bit Cinema DNG RAW internally. You heard me right. 12-bit RAW internal. Of course, you cannot record onto an SD card because SD cards are not fast enough, so you will need an SSD to record onto. But more on that later. The features in this camera are quite impressive. You can shoot MOV files. They do look very nice. The image quality is very nice in this camera, even when it is not RAW. And the ability to shoot RAW internally without an external recorder is very handy because sometimes you just don't have the budget or the room for that external recorder. When you're recording in 4K Cinema DNG, you can record up to 30 frames per second. And if you drop that down to 1080, you can record up to 100 frames per second. More options are unlocked when you record externally. Now that is one thing I need to mention, is that you cannot record compressed RAW internally. It only does uncompressed RAW, which means you're going to have crazy huge files. This camera has a 24.6 megapixel full frame BSI sensor. And for the price, getting a full frame sensor is very nice. And that is one of the big pluses of this camera. The FP does have a 49-point AF system, but it is contrast-based AF, so we wouldn't really recommend it for video. It just doesn't have the accuracy that you'd need. When recording an MOV, you can record up to 30 FPS in 4K and 120 FPS in 1080p. When you're recording an MOV, you do not get to choose what bitrate you're recording in. However, you can choose whether you record in all-I or long GOP. So this camera is not just video. It does have some impressive photo features, such as up to 18 FPS for 12 frames in RAW. This camera does not have a mechanical shutter, and that was one of the reasons Sigma was able to make it so compact. Noah will talk about the photo features a little more later on.
So yesterday, Leaf and I came down here to these brown yet still beautiful woods to film a video. Well, we were all around the property. That video was released last week. That was about 5 tripod hacks. And most of that was filmed on this camera, this exact setup, pretty much. We had it on this tripod, we had an SSD plugged into it, just rubber banded to the tripod, and everything was going smoothly. You know, we were setting up shots kind of like this. I was pulling focus on Leaf, pressing record, you know, just checking the audio levels, the exposure. The one slightly irksome thing, besides managing around the SSD sometimes, was the screen was a little bit dim and the focus peaking wasn't great, so it would take me a little while, especially if we were awkwardly behind a tree or something, to pull focus, make sure it was in focus, so that we had a usable shot. Then we go inside, we connect the SSD to Leaf's computer, and we take a look at the footage, and half of it is ever so slightly out of focus. It's to the point where we decided it was still usable for the video, just because we were really liked the content that we ended up filming. But that was really frustrating because, you know, it's a great image once you learn how to work with the image and grade it. And it was a great image except for that slight bit out of focus in some of the shots. On the bright side though, you know, it was easy to move around. This rig is lightweight, we were able to get some cool shots. The battery, we actually lasted the whole time on a single battery, I think. And maybe we ended up switching it halfway through. If so, I don't clearly remember doing so, but you know, if you only have to carry around an extra battery in your pocket, that's not a big deal in my opinion. And that was shooting all DNG RAW, by the way. We ended up having just over 250 gigabytes of files. And even on 2 batteries, I think that's pretty impressive for this camera, which is definitely a plus. Now, by popular request, back when this camera was initially released, Sigma recently released the FPL. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But that also has a viewfinder that you can use the pins right on here, the side here, to connect a viewfinder, so you don't need to worry about the LCD. Which, you know, yay! I'll pick up the viewfinder, use that, except it's $700. $700, somewhere around there, for a viewfinder just seems like a huge ask. You might as well go with a 7-inch Atomos recorder for that price. You're gonna get just as good visibility, you're gonna be able to record even better. So, cutting the viewfinder out of the equation, in my opinion, that just doesn't really make that much sense to me, considering this is a video-centric camera. Now, if you don't want to fork out $700 to fix this issue, you can pick up an external monitor. You can even get some $50 ones and rig that up, and it's a little bit janky, but generally they're sharp enough to pull focus. But you could get a really decent one for $300, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later on. So, what's it like filming with this camera in a studio? Well, it's definitely much easier than outside because of that damn LCD screen. What I will say though is if you're filming by yourself, it will be quite a bit of a challenge. You're going to need some kind of external monitor at the very least. You cannot really rely on the autofocus, meaning you need to pull focus manually, and if you don't have an external monitor, you either need a stand-in subject with a very clearly marked spot for where the camera needs to be and where the subject needs to be, or you need to have someone who knows how to pull focus come in and do it for you. Bit of a hassle. The other problem, if you want to call it a problem, is that there isn't a headphone output, so there's not really a good way to monitor your audio, and right now it could be all messed up and we wouldn't even know it. We're actually recording with a separate recorder up there for redundancy, just in case. Aside from that, there isn't really anything special or standoutish about this camera. It's quite similar to recording with my Sony or Leaf's X-T3 when it comes down to it, because ergonomics are much less prominent when shooting in a studio scenario. You're just setting it up on a tripod and pressing record, basically. The button layout overall is quite nice, so when setting your settings, that's always a plus. But at the same time, there are some very irksome things about setting your settings. For instance, there are basically no customizable buttons or dials. Dials are what really gets me, because you can only have one dial set as the aperture, the other set as the shutter speed. You can even switch the two, but I don't find that very helpful aside from the aperture dial, because there's no case when I'm not going to be shooting with a shutter angle of 180, and when I want to change my ISO, that means that I have to go into the quick settings menu, navigate to the ISO, use the dial to change it, instead of just using the dial without those extra buttons and navigating to the quick menu. Also, audio levels. You can't even put them in the quick settings menu. That means you have to go into the full menu. You have to navigate to audio record settings, you have to make sure it's on, then you have to press another button. You have to go 4 or 5 levels deep in order to get to the actual levels, and they only have them in 5 decibel increments. You can't adjust them with a dial to have the perfect audio levels. They're either going to be a little bit quiet or a little bit loud in most situations. Yeah, you can adjust the audio levels in post-production. We probably do that most of the time anyway, but this camera doesn't exactly have amazing preamps. But on the bright side, as we've already been saying, the image off this thing is really good. In case you missed it down in the lower third, we're currently recording in DNG 8-bit on the FP, and I think it looks pretty dang good. And this is even the kit lens, which you can get for only $200 more than the $1,700 base price, which in my opinion is a steal. This camera can also live stream. Currently you're hearing the audio and seeing the video from this camera plugged into my computer via USB-C to USB-A and brought into OBS. We did a full live stream with it, so we had some experience trying to use it, and we had some problems with the audio and its delay. Probably right now there's a good bit of delay between the video you're seeing and the audio you're hearing, and it was a little bit frustrating. When I used this camera in Zoom, it wasn't an issue. Zoom might have some automatic audio syncing technology that OBS doesn't have, but even when we tried manually syncing it with audio delay in OBS, we never got it quite perfect in about the 10 minutes that we had to try to solve the issue. The image, though, looks pretty good. I do not believe you get any control over the picture profile that's going out of the camera into the computer, but I might be wrong there. If we hold up a color checker in the scene, we can see that the colors aren't too bad. Currently, the picture profile is set to neutral. And on note of the audio delay, I should mention that we are pulling audio directly from the FP. We have a microphone here plugged into the FP, and then OBS is pulling an audio source from the FP. So, maybe there's some kinks to work out, but it is possible to live stream with this camera without a capture card, and it's a very nice 1080p image. So let's start out with the color profiles. I'm gonna start scrolling through them right here, and I'm gonna bring up a specific one when I start mentioning it. The first one, which my guess is most people will shoot in if they're shooting MOV, is standard. Right out of the camera, you put it in the editor, and it looks really good. But the colors are surprisingly quite accurate overall, which is nice. And you can push the image a decent amount if you want to tweak it a little bit here and there. Most of the others I would disregard, but there are 3 in particular that I want to mention. Neutral is my favorite mode to shoot in. This is going to be the best in terms of gradability if you want to shoot in MOV, but you still want some control over how your image looks. You would be inclined to think that the either Cine or color mode off would be the best. And this was my initial impression too. I went straight to the Cine mode because I thought it would be overall the best color profile for gradability, but no, it is actually among the worst, maybe worst 5. The other one, which I mentioned, is color mode off, or color profile off, whatever it is, and this one is alright. It gives you a sort of pseudo log look. It's actually more neutral than the neutral profile. However, I don't like this mode because for some reason it looks really over sharpened, and I actually ended up adding some blur to some of the clips I shot at color mode off because it looks better that way. The digital sharpening is just not good there, and neutral, that isn't as big a deal. Now, this is a good time to mention that you don't have the option for a custom color profile. You don't get to set a profile with the exact saturation, the exact sharpness, contrast you want, which I think is a little bit disappointing, because that's kind of a standard in most cameras. You just get very little control over the compressed files of the FP. But that's not to say they don't look great. If you know how to use this camera, then the MOV or DNG files look really, really good, and so really, it's not that big a deal. If you really want to grade your footage, shoot DNG. If you want a little bit of control, shoot neutral in MOV. If you don't want to do anything with this footage, you just want it good straight out of the camera, shoot standard. In terms of the colors for the DNG footage, while it being raw, this is easily the most gradable profile. The colors, though a little bit dull, coming straight out of camera, which is to be expected, all look great. And since you have so much white balance, flexibility in post-production, you hardly even need a color checker to work with this footage. unless you're in weird lighting conditions or something. By the way, all these ISO tests were shot on the kit lens that comes with this camera. Just thought I would mention that. And then I set the camera to different ISOs. I compensated the exposure using aperture, and then I shot in different compressions, different file formats, and most of the MOV clips were shot in neutral. The first couple were shot in standard by mistake, and then there are just a couple other things I need to mention before we actually look at the footage. First off, the ISO 100 and 400 clips were all underexposed by about 3/4 of a stop, and that was intentional because, you know, those ISOs should be really good and they should be able to be brought up if they're underexposed. So I wanted to give this camera a bit of a hard time at those ISOs, so I underexposed it a little bit. Okay, so looking at these clips, most of these until the end are shot at 4K. ISO 100 at 4K looks awesome. It looks super clean, super sharp, both DNG and MOV. ISO 400 is still really good. If pixel beep in, you can see some noise, but between DNG 8-bit, 12-bit, MOV all I versus long GOP, there's really not that much of a difference. It all looks really good. ISO 1000, which was my next step up, this is a little different story. We can definitely make out some more noise, and there is more difference between the clips. We're seeing a hint of color shift. I would actually say, in this case, that the 8-bit DNG is actually a little bit cleaner than the 12-bit DNG. But at the same time, if you're shooting 12-bit, you may be able to do some better noise reduction in post-production. There really is any difference between high or long GOP for the MOV clips. Now jumping to ISO 6400. This is where I would draw the line for usable footage. And even then, that would be with noise reduction and maybe only in specific scenarios. Looking at the clips, we can see the DNG 12-bit is definitely noisier than the 8-bit, with 10-bit being pretty in between. There's definitely a difference with the MOV, which has less color noise. The DNG is perhaps a little bit noisier, but the noise is a bit smaller. Whereas in the MOV clip, you get a little bit more of those compression noise artifacts where it's a little bit blockier. Anything past 400 is just unusable. The color shift is even more pronounced here. Now at 10,000 ISO, I did shoot UHD versus FHD, but wow, was there a difference at 10,000? You can really see it. I went all the way up there just so that we got the most stark difference possible. And the full HD, the 1080p, was way noisier than the 4K. And this remains the case for MOV or DNG. The full HD is always noisier. There really isn't much of a difference. Since the pixels are the same, it's really quite even. The uncropped might be slightly sharper, but I also noticed it had a little bit more noise. I'll put it up on the screen, but if I remember correctly, these crop tests were shot at 6400 ISO so that I could get an idea of the noise. So which in doesn't really matter. Just depends on what lenses you have, what focal range you need, what your space is like. Dynamic range is really excellent, but again, you have to know how to use the camera. In DNG, my recommendation is go into use Resolve. Use DaVinci Resolve for this. You can use the free version. You can color grade the footage and then export it with most of the data still there, and then edit it in Final Cut or Premiere or whatever you want to do. But with DaVinci's Camera Raw, you can get a lot of data from this image. My recommendation with RAW is to set the camera RAW settings one of two ways before adjusting exposure and tint and all that. With the Rec. 709 sRGB, if you turn on highlight recovery, you're not going to see much of a difference, if any. So if you don't have a scene that requires much dynamic range, that's the one you can use. And you can just use the highlight slider or the shadow slider to bring up or down the shadows or highlights a little bit, and that'll give you a good amount of dynamic range. If you're shooting in a really tough situation, like outside, I would set it to the Blackmagic option, turn on highlight recovery, and suddenly you have way more dynamic range. Okay, so overall, the image quality is really, really good. DC crop doesn't really affect it. The ISO performance is fine. If you have an f1.4 lens, then in low light situations you should be just fine. And the color modes, if you know how to use them, it's fine. Regardless of the color profile, you're gonna get a good image. You just need to choose the right profile to tune it to how you like. Here we see some autofocus tests that we performed. We set the camera up on a tripod in our studio like we would normally do when going to film a video, and we just put Leaf in the scene here, moving around a little bit. We had a card to put in front of the lens at times that just clarifies whether it's autofocus continuous or single time autofocus. And currently you are watching the footage from the continuous AF, which, as you can see, is hopeless, honestly. As we mentioned, this camera only has contrast-based autofocus points, and only 49 of them at that. Even when we stick the card straight in front of the lens, clearly obstructing it, unless it takes up the entire frame. With the camera automatically choosing where to focus, it's just hopeless and unusable. If you set it to single point, it's a little bit better, but honestly, not much at all. And here we see the single autofocus, so you will see me pressing the button to focus the camera as the scene changes. And yes, this is a little bit better. You could use this if you are filming yourself and you are going to remain a constant distance away from the camera, but still I would rather just use manual focus. With the way this thing can hunt sometimes, even with a clear subject, it is painstakingly slow. I find it easier to manual focus, honestly. So don't expect to be vlogging with this camera or filming yourself in any other way. You need a person behind the camera.
I want to talk about what it is actually like to shoot with this camera. So I have many things to say about this camera and about the experience of shooting with it, but most of those are going to be in the discussion section at the end. I'm just going to give you a condensed version right here. So for an example of what it's like to shoot, I'm going to try filming my dog. And this is probably one of the most important points I will make. Oh, maybe I don't. So after shooting my dog for a little bit and my brother playing with him, there are a few things that really stand out. Of course, I had to shoot at f14, but it's a super sunny day and any camera's gonna have to do that. This actually helped me out in this situation because of the lack of autofocus on this camera. At f14, I was able to get a lot of the image in focus. And when this camera gets an image in focus, it's absolutely gorgeous. It's a great image. However, it can be kind of hard to focus because of this tiny, dim LCD screen on it. And while it could be brighter, still the size of it makes it very hard to focus, especially fast-moving subjects like a running dog. Also, the focus peaking seems to not be terribly accurate. It just is a little bit off. Anyhow, I love using this camera, but the lack of designated cinema glass that would have a large focus ring for me to use, the lack of a usable LCD for focusing in bright conditions. That's different indoors. Indoors, it's fine. Those two things combined make it very difficult to use this camera when shooting fast-moving subjects or doing the type of shooting that I do, which is vlogging or taking videos of my pets, some of my family, friends, more fast-paced shooting. One-man show run-and-gun shooting. And none of that's to mention that we have to attach this grip, plug in an SSD, because this camera has no handle here. And I think for what this is, having a full-size grip on it is pointless. It's not necessary. That's not what this camera is designed for, in my opinion. But if you're trying to use it for the one-man run-and-gun shoots, it can be a little bit harder because you have to rig it out to have a handle, because there's no way you're going to hold on to this and get a steady shot. You can always grip the camera like this around the frame, but if you have an SSD hanging off, you're probably going to want somewhere to attach that so it's not just dangling there. If you have a long cord, you can actually throw the SSD in your pocket to shoot. Actually, that's what I do for charging my camera. This. Okay, I'm getting off topic here. So that's my overall opinion of shooting with this camera. It's a great image when you're able to get a shot in focus, but probably my biggest issue with this camera is the usability in a fast-paced, single-person run-and-gun shoot. There are a few more things that I want to mention about shooting with this camera. And the first one is the excellent dynamic range. When you are shooting in Cinema DNG RAW, the amount of dynamic range you have, especially the amount of flexibility you have with it in post-production, is astonishing. I mean, you can pull back highlights you never thought you'd see again. And it really can help, especially if there's a window in the background or a bright sky in the background of your shot, and you don't want that blown out white look in the background. Then there are a couple of downsides, but this is primarily when shooting MOV. The lack of more shooting options in this camera is a little bit irritating. For instance, I cannot pick my bitrate when in an MOV file. I'm stuck with whatever they have it set at, which we couldn't even find online. So I have no idea how much data I'm actually recording unless I go in, look at the length of the clip, divide that by the amount of, by how big the clip is, and it's just a hassle. Then there is the annoyance of not shooting DCI 4K, so true 4K, the 17:9 aspect ratio, actually 4,000 pixels across. Now, I know most cameras don't actually do this, including Noah's Sony, but it is a nice feature to have, and especially in such a video-oriented camera, you'd think it would include that. For instance, my Fujifilm X-T3 includes DCI 4K. Now, there is image stabilization in this camera. It's digital image stabilization, so not the best, but I understand why they did not put sensor shift stabilization, because that would increase the size of this camera greatly because it's a full frame sensor. So it's there. You can use it when necessary. However, the digital stabilization is only available when you shoot MOV, not DNG. But it will allow you to avoid needing to crop out pixels in post to stabilize your footage, which means you can record 4K, export 4K.
Alright, so Leaf is pretty new at DaVinci Resolve and color grading, and he doesn't have a hard time doing it, but he just wanted me to step in and show you what it's like to work with these clips. Now, something nice about recording on SSDs is you don't need to fill up your computer hard drive with all those big DNG files. You can put them on the SSD, plug it into your computer, you can color the footage and then export it in a smaller file size and work with it to keep and work with it later if you want, or just delete the files when you're done with it. But to work with these files, it's really simple. You don't need to be intimidated by RAW. What I do is I just go into DaVinci, and you can't import these files, at least in DaVinci, using the Control-I and go to Windows Explorer. You're going to have to use DaVinci's own, or whatever editor you have, their own file explorer kind of thing. So I'm here in Media Pool. I can go up to Media Storage, and this is all the drives on the computer. The D is the one that is the SSD and has the files on it. So I just navigate to Cinema, and I can select these folders and drag them in, and it will register them as clips. If you go into the folder, you can see the clip there. So we can go back out of that. I'll just hit Control A to select all the clips, and then I'll drag them in, and bada bing, bada boom, it's done. And now we can start playing around with some of these clips. I'll go into the Edit tab and just drag a couple of these clips of Leo the puppy into the timeline to color with and show you what a great image and how easy it is to work with these clips. It's in the Color tab. And earlier, here's what I was saying about using the camera raw settings. The decode you want to set that to using clip. The color space, you either want Rec. 709 with a gamma of sRGB, or a color space of Blackmagic design if you want all that highlight detail. If you want the highlight detail, it's best to enable highlight recovery. And then here we can finesse the image in a lot of different ways. We can bring up the exposure. It's just a simple matter of the sliders. And there's a little bit of delay here just because this is a laptop, and so it's not the most powerful computing device out there, but even my 4-core laptop from a couple of years ago can handle DNG clips when editing off an SSD. They don't really require as much decoding as compressed file type like MOV, despite the fact that it's a much higher bit rate. So as I was saying, we can just play around with these clips, bring down the highlights, add some saturation, and the rest of this is just basic color grading techniques, and you can look at plenty of videos about those. But it's pretty easy to get a good looking image on here. If I go to, say, this clip somewhere, where's a good sharp frame? There we go. I like that frame. We go down to clip. There aren't that many highlights in this image, so I can just do Rec. 709 sRGB. You see the highlight recovery doesn't do a lot in sRGB. Now I can finesse this image how I want. Add some saturation. White balance is pretty much perfect already with just a little bit of saturation. It's a good looking image. And we play this. I just think this image looks amazing. And the footage you can get off this camera is awesome. What about the photo features of this camera? Well, at a first glance, they might seem impressive. It can do something like 18 frames, continuous electronic shutter, because of course it has no mechanical shutter in RAW, except then you find out that that's only for 12 frames, meaning you don't even get a second of continuous shooting, which is unfortunate. But at the same time, even despite that kind of drawback, this really isn't meant to be a photo camera. It should not be treated as a photo camera, and hardly as a hybrid camera. It's really a video-centric camera, and mainly that's because it comes down to the fact that this has no mechanical shutter. Also, just ergonomically, this isn't photo-oriented. It's meant to either be rigged out as a video camera or put into a small or difficult space.
Now that we have gone out and shot with this camera in many different scenarios, we have found that the ergonomics can sometimes be quite irritating, especially that horribly dim LCD screen. So I want to go over what you can realistically expect to be spending when you purchase this camera. So as we said, the camera is $1,700, which is a good deal. If you want to slap on another $200 and get the kit lens, which I highly suggest, then you get a lens with it. And this lens is probably the best kit lens I have ever used. Generally, if you buy the lens separately, it costs about $500. So let's just assume you're spending $1,900 for camera and lens, and that'll get you a good start. However, you're gonna need SSDs to record raw video. I'm assuming you're buying this camera for the raw video capabilities. So that will be a few $100s. I would say you're gonna wanna spend about $300 to $400 in SSDs, so you get plenty of storage space for all that raw video. As we mentioned, at this camera's max record setting, you only get about 50 minutes on a terabyte of storage. So you're gonna want a good $400 worth of SSDs. So that brings our grand total up to $2,300. Now, you're also gonna want a monitor because that screen is basically useless outside on a sunny day. So a monitor, a good one, 4K monitor, that's gonna run you anywhere from $300 to $500. So now for all the newbies out there, when I say 4K monitor, I mean it supports a 4K input. The screen's actually not 4K because that doesn't really matter. What you just want is a good screen that you can pull focus on. So getting that monitor with a 4K input, let's just say you go for one that's $300. Well, now you're looking at $2,600. And for the capabilities, I think that's still a really good deal for what you're getting. Now, we could go another route, and you could forget the SSDs, forget the monitor, and go straight for something like an Atomos Ninja 5. An external recorder will allow you to unlock a few more recording features and settings like frame rates in raw video. And something like the Atomos Ninja 5 is a great low-end recorder that'll give you plenty of capabilities. So we take that, that's about $500, we add that to our $1,900, we're at $2,400 here. Also, you're gonna need some sort of storage device, and again, you're gonna need about $400 worth of SSDs, so that's getting up around $3,000. Again, for $3,000, the capabilities that you would unlock with an external recorder and the SSDs in this camera is just incredible. Now, you will eventually want to get a few more lenses, and I would suggest going with some cinema glass. So you're talking about some $600 to $700 lenses here. However, that can be in the future, and that kit lens that it comes with is of excellent value for just $200 extra to the camera's initial starting price. Another thing you might want to consider is some sort of stabilization device, because this camera does not have any in-body image stabilization other than the electronic stabilization, which I generally would advise not using. This could be an electronic gimbal or a non-electronic gimbal like a Steadicam or whatever the brand name, Glide Cam, Fly Cam, whatever you want. So depending on what you already own and what you would be doing with this camera, you could be spending anywhere from $2,500 to $3,500 realistically. However, I wouldn't let this scare you away because that is still excellent value for the features that you are getting with this camera. So now the only thing that this changes is that the competitors to this camera are different, because now it's not competing with $1,500 cameras, it's competing with the $3,000 cameras. With that said, let's go to Noah with his thoughts on its competitors.
If you want a more detailed analysis, Leaf and I created a spreadsheet which you can access in the description below, and that has several different other cameras on it that we thought were relatively comparable to this camera, considering its features as well as its price once you factor in an external recorder or a monitor, SSDs, all the stuff Leaf just talked about in the previous segment. So first off, let me address the most obvious comparison to this camera, the FPL. And I say that this is the most obvious because, you know, it's the updated version of this camera, or at least it's the newest one in the series, the second so far. However, I also want to start with it because it's the most easy to eliminate, in my opinion. Personally, I don't see why you would buy the FPL when this camera exists. The FPL, the only thing it has going for it is its higher resolution sensor, the 2.4 megapixel sensor. However, in my opinion, this is actually a downside, as A, it means that the readout from the sensor is much, much slower, meaning you get more rolling shutter. You're not gonna have as large a buffer when shooting photos. As I say, I just don't think that that camera makes sense when compared to this camera, because this camera, as we've been saying, it already has such a great image, and those extra megapixels aren't going to do anything for that. So moving on, we have the A7C. Now this is priced $100 more expensive than the FP, but the video specs just don't match up. It only records internal 4208-bit 4K up to 30 megabits a second. So yes, it does have its size going for it, and yes, you can unlock 422 8-bit if you go with an external recorder, but that just doesn't make much sense to me either. What this camera does have going for it over the FP is better photo features. Also, it does have 5-axis image stabilization while maintaining a quite compact body. So, not to say it's a bad camera, but if your focus is on video, then this isn't going to make sense to you. We also threw in the Fuji X-T3, and in my opinion, this is perhaps the most competitive camera to the FP that there is, simply because it's priced the same as the FP, but you don't need an external recorder, a monitor, or SSDs necessarily, while it still records 4K, 60 FPS, up to 400 megabits a second, and once you go with an external recorder, you get 10-bit. Sure, it's not raw, but as we've kind of been saying, not a lot of people actually need RAW, and you'll hear that more in the discussion, which I believe is the next segment. Canon EOS R makes much more sense for photo than for video, in my opinion. And you really shouldn't, if you really like EF glass, you shouldn't have any problems adapting that to L mount, because you're not going to lose any autofocus performance anyway, since the FP, its focus just isn't great. A7S III, really, really expensive compared to the FP, almost double the price. However, it's only about $400-ish, $500-ish dollars more expensive once you factor in SSDs, an external recorder, perhaps a grip or a stabilizer of some sort. Just depends on how far out you go, so we want to include it anyway. It can do 422 10-bit UHD 4K internal at 120 FPS, which, yeah, it still isn't raw, but in my opinion, that's not a big deal. And it has awesome autofocus. It's still quite small and compact. It has 5-axis image stabilization, and its low light performance is stupidly good. Also, something we haven't been mentioning, but is also on this spreadsheet, is the screens. The A7S III has a fully articulating touch screen, much better menus than the FP. So, Panasonic S1, S1H, especially with the S1H, it is a very similar story. Again, you can check out this comparison thing we made. Panasonic GH5S, I think, is a very, very close competitor to the FP. But in my opinion, I think that the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K comes in even closer because it's cheaper at $1,300, but it also does raw internal 4K DCI up to 60 FPS. It also has ProRes 422 HQ in it at DCI 4K up to 60 FPS again. So that has a lot going for it. It's also not quite as small. It's called the Pocket Cinema camera, but it's really not quite as small. Also, the FP has a much larger sensor. I'm not sure how the low light on the Blackmagic 4K is, honestly. And, you know, you get other bonuses with that full-frame sensor, and it's in a smaller body. So that's really close in my opinion. Same goes for Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 6K and the 6K Pro. In both cases, you're going with a bigger body. That's really the downside to all these other cameras. What the FP is going for is its compact size and its raw recording. And all of these cameras either don't have raw recording or just aren't as compact as this camera. However, as we were saying, when you kit this camera out, suddenly you lose that size, that form factor. But a lot of time, the average consumer doesn't need that small form factor. They don't need to attach it to a car or get it in some really small space most of the time. So why would you bother kitting this camera out, spending an extra $1,000 or so on this camera in order to get around the lack of stabilization, the bad screen, the unreliable autofocus, when there's the other competition out there which solve those issues by having reliable autofocus, a better screen, and in-body image stabilization? Well, it's because when you kit it out, suddenly you have better solutions to those problems than you get in camera. a gimbal is going to be smoother stabilization than 5-axis in-body stabilization on a camera as small as the A7C. A screen from something like an Atomos Ninja 5 or an external monitor that costs $300 to $400 is going to be much better than any of those other screens because it'll be brighter and smaller since it's external. So that means this camera makes sense in two different places. Either when you want a good budget camera that can get you very, very good professional quality images, and you want to rig it out, or if you need the good professional quality images, but you need it in a very, very small form factor. Suddenly you have those two options and you don't need an in-between. With something like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K Pro or the S1H, despite the name of the Blackmagic, both of those cameras are very large and you're not going to be able to do the same things as you will with the FP when it comes to usefulness of small form factor. So, which makes sense? Well, I can't decide for you. That's something you need to decide for yourself. But with all that said, to help you make that decision, let's go on to the discussion segment where we're going to kind of discuss these quirks a little bit more. Okay, so now you are either watching one of two things. Either you are watching the condensed version of this discussion in the actual review video of the FP, or you are watching the full discussion that we are about to have, which we uploaded as a separate video to YouTube, and who knows how long that is. It may end up being an hour even.
Yes, the last segment where I was talking about how it is to shoot with this camera in the real world, for me, my experience with it. And this is where we kind of ran into the contradiction that this camera is. So it's primarily marketed towards a lower end, like a lower end market, the average consumer, which to me doesn't make sense for a few reasons, and then makes sense for a couple of reasons. So I'm going to go over why they'd market it towards your average consumer. One, its price. It's $1,700. That's cheap. Two, it can live stream. That's a great feature in a camera. Three, it shoots RAW for cheap. So right there, you're like, wow, I get this camera that shoots RAW for cheap, and I can live stream with it. And that's great for lower budget, YouTubers. But then comes the problem where there's no compressed RAW. And uncompressed RAW, which is what this camera shoots, are absolutely enormous files. A terabyte can be filled up with just like 40 to 50 minutes of recording at its highest record setting.
Yeah, it gets about 50 minutes on a terabyte at DNG 12-bit.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely insane. So with no compressed RAW, you're running into these massive file sizes that are just... Yes, you can edit it on a fairly average computer, but the amount of storage you need and the amount of money it costs to store this is through the roof. So it ends up turning out to be like a $3,000 camera once you consider the expense of recording all that data. And then you're like, is this really the best option for a lower end consumer? Because the idea of RAW is nice, but when it's uncompressed, doesn't make sense to me. So I will have to say here, if this camera excels in one particular area in my opinion, and that is being a secondary camera in a larger budget shoot, or being a primary camera. It definitely could be in a higher budget production where you are actually using that 12-bit DNG RAW, and you have proper stabilization equipment, you have fluid head tripods, you have nice gimbals, you have cranes, you have all this other equipment necessary, plus external recorders to fully get the true capabilities out of this camera, where you can get an image that's equivalent to some $6,000, $7,000, even $8,000 cinema cameras off of this tiny body. It's just you need to rig it out,
So it ends up costing like $3,000 to $4,000, which is fine,
Right.
considering you're still chopping the price in half from these higher end cinema cameras to get a similar image. But I don't see this as a consumer level camera.
Yeah. And when we say higher budget, we don't necessarily mean a high budget professional movie where they're going to be
Yeah.
spending millions, of course.
No, I'm talking where you might
I
have a
would say
few
if-
grand.
Yeah. Say you have $5,000 spent on equipment for a shoot or just for your style of shooting. And let me get a little bit deeper into this. Leaf and I, when we first heard that Sigma was going to send us this gear, this camera with these lenses, we immediately start brainstorming all these things we could do with it. And one of those things we thought of was a short film of Leaf's puppy Leo, which he's gonna end up shooting this weekend, but he's gonna do it on his Fuji unless he's changed his mind.
Probably going to do it on my Fuji.
And we ended up we planned out the whole review, and we were gonna display this short film in the review. Then we get to his house to film the clip of him outside shooting with it, talking about how it works when shooting his puppy. And before we shot that clip, we ended up having a 20-minute discussion, rediscussing what we were going to be saying in that clip, because we don't even have a monitor. We're a very low-budget production. So with just that LCD, trying to pull focus on a spastic, practically untrained puppy, it would just be really, really difficult, and to work with, and it's going to take a lot of footage to get that. So suddenly, you're talking about a lot of D&G footage, but if you shoot in an MOV, you're going to get log and just overall better quality on, maybe better quality, very
Definitely
similar
better
quality
quality.
at least, on Leaf's Fuji. Now, we've been kind of harping on this camera quite a bit. In the review, we were nitpicking on these little things. We've been complaining about the LCD, and we're talking about how it just doesn't make sense for the market. But at the end of the day, is it a good
Yes.
camera? Yeah. Is it an
Yes.
amazing image? Yeah. And did it inspire us to create awesome content? Very much so. It was extremely exciting to have a new camera in hand, and maybe that was just because we don't use that much new gear all the time. But we both went out and we just shot whatever we saw, whatever we thought could make good shots, even if it was just boring focus pulls of moss. And we enjoyed doing it. So if you want to work with D&G,
This is the camera for you.
you think that this camera's form factor makes sense, you don't mind a couple $100 for a lens with decent focus ring for focus pulling, and SSDs, did I mention that? Then this camera definitely does make sense for you. Compared to the competition, I don't know. It's a personal choice, of course.
I think...
And again, we love this camera. We just think it's a little confusing to us because we're not exactly sure what it's trying to do. Is it trying to be a B camera for professionals who want a small camera to hook onto a car or to a chest mount? Or is it aimed at consumers as a stepping stone for a RAW?
Yeah, and so definitely an amazing camera, high fidelity images, and great specifications. Just make sure that it's right for you, because
Yeah.
it's a confusing camera.
If you're uncertain, I would say rent this camera and try it out for a week. You're gonna need SSD if you want to record RAW, and ideally you'd have a monitor as well.